How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chapulati, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Gordon Brown, and welcome to greeneconomy.tv for the weekly Circular Economy show with Chris Whyte. Before we get started, let's have a word from our sponsors.
This show is brought to you by GBCSA's Positive Impact Magazine.
Right, a warm welcome to Chris Whyte, Director of the African Circular Economy Network, our expert guest as always. Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back.
We're speaking together. We had to postpone this show for a week due to what was going on in the country, and most specifically in Gauteng, and more specifically as it affected you in KZN last week. We've had a long discussion off air. We find ourselves in a situation where, frankly, after or during COVID, one thought, how can this get any worse? And as if by magic, in comes the looting. In Cape Town here, we've got taxi violence, taxi wars going on. People can't travel to work. And all the ramifications and all the effects and all the consequences and all the accelerators that flow from these negative things. At the same time, as rational people, we know that there is really only one thing we can do, and that is to put our shoulders back, keep our chins up, and carry on doing what we know we have to do to feed our families, to keep our businesses going, with obviously as the Afrikaans say, with die sterkte van bo en die what is die genade van bo en die wind van agter. So that being said, Chris, our conversation today is part of a series of conversations that we've been having about how to apply circular economy thinking to solve many of the problems that exist in the economy, and also to take advantage of opportunities to, in some cases, to change, in some cases, to actually try to leapfrog as a developing country. Let's not go through the same steps. Let's go straight to best practice. Today we're talking about metals. It's part one of a two-part series to talk about metals. But before we talk about the circular economy thinking, let's just try to define the problems as we see them. So we've got a linear system in place. We extract the metals, we export them. Some we process, we import products with metals in them. In many cases, these metals are not recovered. In some cases, metals are so valuable they get stolen. But perhaps I can ask you just to define the lay of the land, if you like, as far as the flow of some of these key metals are concerned.
Yeah, I think what we need to understand is that this isn't about recycling. This is about metals as an industry, as an opportunity, and as South Africa, we are blessed in terms of our resources. There is a huge volume of materials that are locally mined, but again, we're following a linear mentality and even more so complicating that by massively exporting most of our product. I think the latest stats I have, we mined 67 million tons of iron ore in the last year, and we exported 57 million tons of that. So we have an aging infrastructure in terms of our own processing capabilities. We have not been supporting our industry in terms of being able to look at keeping up to speed with the technology and with the processing capabilities. Even from a metals recycling perspective, the reality is that metals can be recycled almost endlessly. They're one of the most beautiful materials from a recycling perspective. But our own production is dropping year on year. I think in 2019, we had a 17.8% drop in steel production. So we're trying to see how we respond to that. And what we're doing is we look at issues. So there was a price preference system, which we put into place in 2020, which is going to be replaced by a tax in August this year, to try and stop the leakage of our materials getting outside the country. And yet we face other problems in that we don't have energy efficient steel production systems. We have an aging infrastructure. We're not able to compete globally. So how do we look at the entire system where we start becoming more carbon sensitive in terms of our production facilities? We need to look at manufacturing locally. And we've raised this before in a previous one when I spoke about issues around the European, the new Green Deal. And we're seeing the policies and the directives overseas very clearly showing that we are pre-COVID, and then, of course, the thump of COVID, the fragility of our global supply chains, and the fact that we are now exporting massive tons of iron ore to Europe, who now are no longer able to meet their own low carbon objectives and energy objectives in terms of processing there. So the focus with the new Green Deal is to invest and create the development in Africa. And there's an opportunity that we face, and we need to grab that with both hands. So we need to become a new leader in terms of being able to utilize our own resources. And there's great opportunities in that. Even if we look at the application from perspective of keeping the materials here locally, beneficiate locally. We shouldn't be exporting iron ore. We should be manufacturing steel locally. And investing into that infrastructure creates jobs. It creates opportunities. It then allows us to become more globally competitive. But we've let that slip over the last 20, 25 years. So we're now playing catch up, and playing catch up is difficult. So we need to take a long, hard look at ourselves and look at the entire metal industry and see how we can get back to our former glory. We're seeing an annual slip in terms of production. We have brilliant recycling rates. We're looking at probably 90% recovery of metals. Again, the bulk of those are being exported. And we've got to look at local applications in terms of shoring up our own jobs and shoring up our own manufacturing applications and opportunities.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. And I want to just chat about this the steel industry for a moment in a global sense. I mean, we're not alone, I wouldn't think, in this trend. In fact, we're probably experiencing it quite late, is this trend away from heavy industries in perhaps traditional places. I mean, you and I grew up in the 80s. I remember Bon Jovi songs, where they you see metal factories closing down and workers queuing up in bread lines and getting social security checks, and everyone getting all, teary in the eye about the fact that these big monster steelworks are closing down and so forth. I mean, that was 30 years ago, and I think that there's been an ongoing trend. And for all his faults, we heard from Donald Trump how he was going to try and reverse this and bring all this heavy industry back and create jobs and do so. The question I have around that is to ask you, what are the trends globally? Is it possible to for America, for example, to try to bring back the heavy industry that perhaps let go? Is it even good to have these industries back? I mean, think about it. You've mentioned the environmental impacts, but also, are they jobs that people actually want? Who wants to work in a steelworks? I mean, I don't. What are the global trends, and what are the opportunities for us? Perhaps there's this green steel opportunity where we can create the energy from renewables, use that to create the steel. What's the modern approach? What sort of factories should we be investing in, which are safe and which are future-proof, powered with, as I say, maybe renewables? Maybe there's a massive contract from Europe that we can hook to secure the investment. Maybe just talk about these global trends for a moment, please.
Well, I think that the reality is that we talk about these heavy industries, and we have seen closures in many of the developing nations through the USA and through Europe, and the opportunity really is to ensure that we need to understand technology has changed. In 30 years. The industry is not the same as it used to be in the 80s songs with the guys with the sweaty headbands on. We've become far more energy efficient. We've become far more knowledgeable about chemistry and the processing methodology and the efficiency. And we're also looking at alternative energy systems as well. Not only that, but we're now harvesting our waste heat energy and looking at that regenerating energy from waste heat. And closing the loop on a whole host of these different real bad, massive sort of smelter type systems and old technologies. The problem is that by the developed world not taking this on means that the developing nations are taking it on, and they are using those dirty, old, nasty, cheap systems. So all we're doing is we're moving the problem from our doorstep to somebody else's doorstep. We still need the steel. Steel production has increased year on year since we started looking at this disinvestment. So it hasn't stopped. It's getting bigger, but it's getting more efficient. And the reality is that the developed nations have the opportunity and the financing to be able to do it using the correct technologies and applications and reducing those carbon footprints, reducing the energy needs, increasing the efficiencies. So we're not going to get away from steel. We need the metals in our sector for just about everything. You look at the steel trussing right above my head. The reality is that there's going to be a need. If we look at the devastation, destruction in KZN, and I'm in the center of it here in Pietermaritzburg. I mean, the amount of steel we're going to need now just to rebuild is going to be a nightmare. And steel prices have rocketed recently. And it's because of our lack of production locally. It's because of the fact that we're importing from overseas, and because COVID and other issues mean that transportation logistics are far more expensive. So we've got to take another long, hard look at where we are. And the systems are there. We've got far better, more efficient extraction and efficiency systems in terms of metals production. South Africa is one of the biggest and best producers of high-grade thermal steels, for example, and very few people know that. Some of the stuff that we're doing in the boiler industry and the metals industry is that our source is local. We can't get the same quality of materials elsewhere, but we're not supporting that industry. So we've got to look at these opportunities, and I think that we've got to get our mind out of the gutter in terms of these old, smelly, energy-intensive, dirty systems. Times have changed, technologies have changed, and the reality is we're always going to need steel. So let's embrace the new technologies and the new applications. We have such amazing resources in this country, the opportunity to set ourselves up. As I said, we're processing 10 million tons of the product locally, but exporting 57 million tons. Imagine what we could do from a job creation perspective locally. And we're seeing changes, even in the energy sector. So the reality is that with Ramaphosa's recent discussions in terms of opening it up to 100 megawatt type systems, without going through all of the IPPs and the PPAs and the legislative hurdles of trying to generate energy. That opens up, again, more opportunities to look at energy-intensive industries that can be structured around renewable energies. And there's huge opportunities around that. So we've got to change the way we're thinking, change our mindset, and embrace the circular economy and the opportunities that provides to us.
Let's chat about the automotive industry in South Africa. I mean, we see that these significant investments coming from a range of companies, not one, but probably as many as 6 or 7 major brands setting up massive plants here. They import the engines, I understand, and some of the other intricate parts, but the metal that the cars are manufactured from, that aspect of manufacturing is taking place in South Africa. To what extent are they using South African materials? And to what extent does the automotive industry also supply us with a recycling opportunity for scrap metal from old cars, and perhaps talk about other sources of scrap metal?
Well, this is where the opportunity lies. I think I'm not that au fait with all of the exact statistics. I know that I think our local production capacity is about 7 million tons of steel. But we've also got to remember our automotive sector is not a massive manufacturing sector. It's largely an assembly sector. There are huge components and parts that come in from all over the world. So we still have the situation where we're exporting our iron ore. It's being produced into steel overseas, manufactured into components, and then brought back into here for assembly. There are moves afoot. There's big talk through some of the big OEMs, I won't mention names, in terms of reinvigorating that local manufacturing component. And the scrap metal industry is one key opportunity for that, instead of exporting it. So if we look at the fact, again, that scrap metal is, again, highly recyclable, very low lossy system, and the opportunity is that it's 25% of the energy requirement for recycled steel than it is for manufacturing from raw materials. So we should be focusing on that, not exporting those resources. But at the same time, we need the infrastructure to be able to cope with that. And it's not just the infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's also politics. So we have quasi-governmental and governmental controls on some of our big producers. And that causes issues as well in terms of being sort of internationally and globally competitive, where we've got to look at government providing incentives and opportunities that is going to bring that steel manufacturing back. It's a massive employer. The numbers already, I think we're talking about, some people mentioned 350,000 people across this country are involved in metal recycling in terms of our informal sector. That is massive, but yet we're not looking at targeting the upper end of the scale in terms of remanufacturing. So I think in 2013, we were only exporting 40% of our iron ore. We had a 24 billion rand industry with 29,000 jobs. I couldn't find the latest statistics in terms of that, but it's significantly less than that. As I said, 2019, we had a 17.8% reduction in local steel manufacturing. We need to shore that up. The opportunity in terms of the fourth industrial revolution and in terms of circular economy, the technology is there to be far more efficient with regards to steel manufacture. Components can now be 3D printed. We need to look at those sort of highly efficient systems where we can start becoming leading edge technology developers to create components and applications for our own industries. But we're relying on the rest of the world. You know, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and I think, you know, we've just gone back to the second industrial revolution in South Africa after the recent nonsense that's been happening. So we kind of missed 3, and we're still thinking about 4. But it's there. The opportunity is there. Let's grasp that. Let's look at providing incentives. We've got to look at government really gearing up and taking some solid decisions. They, you know, talk about recycled metals. They need to develop a good pair of brass cojones and say, right, this is how we are going to fix this industry. and put investments in. Look at the development. We've got to make sure we can bring in, we have some of the best engineering skills in the world in this country. We are losing them daily overseas because that's where the opportunities are. How do we change that? And it can be done. It needs solid decisions made at national government level. This is one tiny sector of the circular economy that could have a massive impact. And we could do the same thing right across the spectrum of all the different material resource fields. So let's focus on that. The idea behind just using the International Trade Advisory Commission to slap an export on everything is not the answer to the issues. We've got to look at the entire value chain. We need to understand where the problems are. And we know where the problems are. As industry, we understand that, but government's not really listening that carefully. But the opportunities are to revive that, and it could have massive implications for the growth and development of this country.
Talk to me about this relationship between government and the private sector and the steel market for a moment. I mean, obviously we know that what we know today is ArcelorMittal was formerly Iscor, which was a sort of state-owned enterprise. But I mean, I think it was a good thing that the state exited the market. Private sector came in, international company, of course. But surely, I mean, the role of government, as I see it, would be to ensure that the infrastructure, okay, power maybe, and that ship has sailed, so now it's independent power, but infrastructure in the form of rail and transport networks and so forth. But if you've got the demand, governments come to the party with protectionist strategy, whether it's wrong or right, at the very least it's protectionist. Surely there's enough right now, certainly, for someone like ArcelorMittal or some other big steel concern to come in and say, you know what, let's invest. What are the key blockages? What if you were running the department related to this in government? What would you do? What are the sort of 5 key things you think need to happen to unlock this linear problem we have and begin to turn it into the potential for a more circular outcome?
Well, metals is not my primary focus, so I'm not a global expert in this, and I'm pretty sure if there's anybody in the metals industry who is listening into this at the moment, they're probably frothing at the mouth already and saying, well, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, this is how we need to get it happening. The reality in terms of where we are, I mean, the Saldanha Steel closed down recently, and the reasons behind that are largely political and economic. And, we need to look at what went wrong and understand those issues and say, right, how do we get government intervention out of it? The private sector knows what it needs to do. The government should be creating an enabling environment. I'm not too au fait with all the ins and outs of that, but I know it's broken. There are constantly emails coming across my desk in terms of the issues around competition, or the issues around government policy and procedure. So there's a lot wrong with the system. And people in the metals industry know what's wrong with the system and they know how to fix it. But we need government to, as I said, grow a couple of brass ones and, come to the party and make it happen. We have massive resources that we are exploiting at the moment, and some that are yet to be exploited. And the opportunity in terms of driving that, again, should be looking at this entire refocus around a circular economy. So let's look at the right technology. Let's look at our supply chains. Let's look at transportation, logistics, look at local manufacturing, bring in fourth industrial revolution, bring in high-tech stuff. We're driving a massive market at the moment to look at solar, and yet we're importing most of our materials. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The opportunity in terms of driving innovation and application to look at solar panel manufacturing here, even if it's not just the microfilms, even if we look at the housing systems that should be manufactured locally using local materials, there's big opportunities in terms of driving that market. But in terms of building this economy, we need to ensure that we have steel. And it's for everything from from the shop counters that have all seemed to walk into the townships over the last few days, through to the engineering works that we need for our manufacturing and other systems. But it's a broken system. It needs a lot of intervention, and I think there are a lot of good people working on it. So I have high hopes, but we've got a long way to go, and we're just missing the boat completely because we're eroding a potential market system constantly, and there's just too much that we're missing out on. And again, let's take that focus back from where we've come from. Things have changed. There's different systems, different technologies, different applications. Let's grasp with both hands the latest technology and the latest innovations. Let's look at what has happened globally. I mean, if you look at some of the policies and directives, for example, with the work I've been doing in Rwanda, that have driven positive trade balances, it can be done. South Africa shouldn't be learning from our northern neighbors. We should be leading. We have the African Free Trade Agreement that has just come through. It should be opening up opportunities left, right, and center, but we haven't got all the other policies and systems around that to support that. And there are huge opportunities that we can tie into with that. Just to service our own continent. Forget about exports. There's massive opportunities in terms of the development and growth of Africa without having to look at the European or Asian markets.
Chris, we've got a few minutes left. I want to bring the conversation down to a more micro scale. We've been talking really at an economic, sort of a macroeconomics of scale. That's such as the nature of the industry. But we've got these flows of recycled steel that are coming through. What are the opportunities at a smaller scale? Well, what is the smallest metal smelting operation that entrepreneurs could possibly consider getting involved in, purely focused on recycled flows? Perhaps it's a product they might, perhaps it's those beams you have behind you there, or some other product in the market. There's a buyer, there's a supply. All I have to do is plop a processing plant in the center. What sort of opportunities exist in that regard?
That's where we need to understand the opportunity. I mean, from a circular economy perspective, supply chain is one of the critical issues. So to be moving materials backwards and forwards doesn't make sense. There are some amazing new technologies where you could set up a system as small as 50 to 100 tons a month that could manage to process local materials into high-value products. And they are far cleaner than the previous old 1980s videos. There's great opportunities in terms of looking at empowerment and distribution. So looking at transformation of an economy where we take out the peripheral costs of moving materials and transport and logistics. So the systems and applications are there. It's a simple case of just look at Google. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I think the opportunity with the alternative energy application, that really opens up a huge opportunity where we can now say, right, we can't rely on Eskom. We never will be able to rely on Eskom, and Eskom will die eventually. But the opportunity is that we need to look at these alternative energy systems and renewable energy systems that can power these sort of applications at a smaller sort of, they're not small scale, they're kind of mid-scale applications. So there's a good lot of investment that's required, but create jobs locally, start shortening those supply chains, and start looking at local production. And again, focus on 4IR, look at engineering key components that can start going into our vehicle manufacturing components and the such like, rather than importing these components from China or Japan.
Chris, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your insights and your thoughts, and just a special goodwill message across from Cape Town here, and Byron and myself, to you and your family and the communities in KZN. We wish you a speedy recovery from what's happened. Hopefully our taxi drivers on this side will find it in their hearts to shake hands and enter into a truce so we can get the people in Cape Town back on the roads and back to work. And yeah, next week we're going to pick this conversation up. We're going to talk about other types of metals, aluminium and metals other than steel next week in part 2. So look forward to that. Next week, Wednesday, 1 o'clock, same time, same place. See you then. That's all from me, Gordon Brown at greeneconomy.tv. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Cheers.
This show is brought to you by GBCSA's Positive Impact Magazine.
How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chaplat, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.